Good morning, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us, coming back. I know it was mostly because you just wanted to hear the results of the poll. So let me announce, as I think all of you know, we had a great debate this morning on America's role in the world between Xenia Wickett from Chatham House and Chris Preble from Cato Institute. Is the United States still the indispensable nation? So we started off at 56% in favor of the United States being the indispensable nation, just shy of 25% against that proposition, and 19% undecided. And in the final tally, although we apparently gained, I think, one or two audience members in that time frame, we had a little bit of a shift. We have 64%, so a larger percentage in favor of the resolution or proposition of America as the indispensable nation. Against the proposition actually stayed exactly the same at 25%, so no change there. But the undecideds clearly shifted quite a bit, so there were only 10% left undecided afterwards. I think that was fascinating to hear, I think particularly as the terms of the debate really shifted. It really made us focus on different issues. It's raised already a lot of ideas for ways to follow up on this and for things for us to do afterwards. You're about to hear a session on imagining solutions. Again, we went through yesterday talking about big changes in the world that have already happened, that are continuing to happen, that will happen, and then some potentials for failure, strategic failures, if we don't start to create greater continuity between, or greater connections between how we view the world and how we work in the world, and those changes that we're talking about. So I'm really excited about this next session, which will be about imagining solutions, some ways forward. Peter Schwartz is back with us to help set the scene for this particular piece. We've got some great speakers, as I mentioned before, that I think you'll find very interesting. Let me just mention, we'll do the usual speaking format for this, and Peter will have some time for question and answers. You all will have some time to please jump in and participate and ask questions and make some points as well. Right after that, we are going to roll very quickly into a wrap-up session to really give you not only some impressions of what we, on a panel of a variety of participants here, have thought about this conference, but also want to hear from you on what you thought about this conference. As I said, I think we have a lot of interesting pieces on the table, and what we need to do is figure out how to put them together and move forward. So thanks again for staying with us and coming back. Over to Peter.
Good morning. Is Mike on? Yes. I have to apologize for missing the first session this morning. I'm on the board of the Center for New American Security. We're having a board meeting, and so I just left that board meeting, which is still going on. Though we had a board dinner last night where we actually debated precisely the subject that was the discussion this morning. You might imagine it's also a subject of great interest to CNAS as well. So what I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about to set the stage is what's involved in thinking about solutions, and what some at least propose a particular option from my own experience. I've had the privilege of working with a large number of companies, a fair number of governments over the years in thinking about how to make them more farsighted. How to engage in a longer-term agenda. So in that respect, I want to touch on two important ideas that frame basically what I want to suggest. And the first is the notion of adaptive and emergent strategy. In a world of unpredictability and fundamental inherent uncertainty of the sort I described at the beginning yesterday, a strategy that you lock in and keep in place for X years or decades, like, for example, containment was a national security strategy, a big vision, was plausible in an era where the systems and structures were relatively stable. Containment worked for close to 50 years in the context of a stable Cold War, and most everything fit within that rubric. Much more difficult when the institutions are unstable as the way they are today, and the environment is inherently unpredictable. As a result, it is difficult to imagine a strategy like containment being persistent for the kind of time frame that it was in the Cold War. So in the world of business, we talk about two different kinds of strategies, in a sense. One, which is adaptive in that it gives you enough flexibility that over time you can adapt to the evolving circumstances that you're actually dealing with. Now, let me say, that is not an easy thing to do. It's not obvious. There's not a magic formula for that. But if you begin to think about that in a different way, then that's part of it. Secondly, the concept of emergent strategy, which was developed by Henry Mintzberg, a Canadian academic, basically is the idea that you have a goal in the direction you want to go in, but it is affected by the environment as it plays out, and the real strategy is the result of the interplay between the environment and your intentions. It's a bit like sailing. I'm a sailor. I sail on San Francisco Bay, and unlike a powerboat, which you can point to where you want to go and just go without reference to the tides or the wind or anything else, the real world is much more like sailing, where you actually have to take into account the tides and the wind and so on. And if you don't end up where you want to go. But of course, the tide changes, the wind changes, and so on during the course of the day, and you're constantly resetting your sails and your course to adapt to those evolving circumstances. So I think we need to think about the solutions in the context of this environment of fundamental uncertainty and the need to have strategies that emerge out of that interplay and allow for an adaptation in the real world. Now, in that respect, I want to just, as a footnote to that, if we could, and that's a big if, if we could, the ideal environment is one that actually would be a bit more stable, one with structures that we committed to, structures of the sort that we did have in the Cold War era, but which we have not framed yet. So from that point of view, if we could find a modus vivendi with our adversaries and our allies that actually allowed for a new framework of stable structures and institutions of the sort we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that would actually be a changing of the game and now allow a different kind of strategy to take place. But I'm somewhat skeptical that we can actually get there. But that would be an ideal if we could. Having said that, then the one practical suggestion I want to put forward is that something that I've done in a number of organizations, including when I was in Shell, in Salesforce where I work today, and I've worked in a number of governments. I had the privilege, as I mentioned yesterday, of working with the Singapore government. There we created something called the Center for Strategic Futures that actually works in the Prime Minister's office, helping them to try and anticipate discontinuities and disruptions. So what I want to propose is that a new mechanism. That, in fact, the work that the NIC does, that Matt Burrows led for a number of years on the Global Trends Report, is really quite a remarkable piece of work. It has developed into a high art and a terrific presentation, and I'm sure it has significant impact, but it comes along once every 4 years. And they present it to the incoming president. I'm sure it was well received the last time and absorbed. And then it kind of goes silent for the next 4 years until the new guy comes along, or re-election. Well, it seems to me that that's inadequate. We need something that is more frequent, that is not necessarily daily. So what I've established in organizations is what I call the Discontinuity Committee, and whose job it is to think about major discontinuities and to report on a quarterly basis and engage the leadership of our company, other companies, other governments in thinking about those discontinuities. And I put out something called the Discontinuity Brief before these meetings, where we look at major technological, economic, social, political discontinuities that are going to be consequential to us. They're not abstract, they're meaningful. They're things that actually we have to do something about. We would have to anticipate or prevent or in some way respond to in advance, where there is important reason to know in advance. And let me say, my experience tells me that if you do your homework, you can see these coming, with very, very, very few exceptions. There's almost nothing that has happened in the last 20 to 25 years that has really shocked me. There have been a few things, but very few. And that it is not that they can't be anticipated. As I suggested yesterday, it's denial mostly. So the goal, therefore, is to create a venue where you can have this conversation on a systematic and regular basis and raise the issues. And what I have found is that if you can introduce those ideas in advance of people actually needing them, then they have time to absorb, reflect, and actually bring those ideas to bear when the events actually occur, when the discontinuities actually play out. And that they have a better muscle for reacting to, in an appropriate way, the discontinuous events. So I would suggest that this committee should not be just located in the White House. It should be a joint committee between the Congress and the executive, and that both should be party to that conversation, and both should be thinking about what the major discontinuities are likely to be. If it just sits in the White House or just sits in the Congress, then it is likely to be a competition of ideas rather than a collaboration. Now, I recognize that there's nothing like this. This may be pure fantasy, and that it is purely wishful thinking. But if I had to design the ideal ultimate mechanism, that's what it would look like. So with that, we have quite a remarkable panel. And I'm not going to introduce them each, and give you the bios because you have them all there in front of you. But now our first speaker is Alessandra Orofino. Alessandra, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi. Is this working? No? Oh, now it is. Okay, hi. I'm Alessandra. I come from Brazil. Rio. I don't know if you've ever been there. You should if you haven't. It's quite beautiful, especially this time of year. And I was born there. That's my city. That's where I come from. And I had a very unique, I think, experience of that city growing up because I come from a family, a very unusual family for Rio standards. My mom is from this very wealthy family, comes from a very comfortable background in the city, and my father comes from a very poor background in the city. And therefore, when I was growing up and I was staying with my grandparents for most of my time, I would sometimes be in this mansion in Copacabana, 2 blocks from the beach, with maids and a crazy life. And sometimes I would be with my grandmother on my dad's side in one of the city's worst neighborhoods that was getting extremely violent in the 90s when I was growing up. So that gave me a sense of how the city was actually developed and how investments were made in that city and how people related to public space. And that relationship was incredibly different depending on where you went. Another thing that was very different between my paternal grandmother's life and my maternal grandmother's life was their relationship to nature and to what the city could actually offer in terms of its very privileged landscape and its amazing opportunities for leisure and direct contact with nature. And at some point in the late 90s, that relationship changed for both of them. Because at that point, the way the city was developing without any preoccupations with sustainability and actually preserving its natural environment, it started to impact not just the poor, but the rich too. So then all of a sudden, my maternal grandmother could no longer really go to the beach because it was kind of filthy and terrible and disgusting. And that hit her, I think, a lot harder than any of the patterns of social exclusion that the city had seen for so many years, really since it was founded. And I'm telling you this story because I think that cities, in a way, embody 2 of the world's biggest challenges right now, and they are microcosms for how those dynamics will evolve over time. They are at the front lines of one of our biggest battles, and that is the battle against economic inequality and the systematic exclusion of entire groups of people from public life. And they are also at the front lines of climate change and our battle for preserving the natural environment in which we live in. And what's interesting about that is that in cities, we also see a pattern in which the way inequality affects the rich is mostly through social unrest and violence, and the way the lack of a sustainable plan for development affects the rich is through, well, affecting everyone together. Those are the kinds of problems that we cannot run away from. We can try to hide them, we can try to pretend they're not there, but they will come back to bite us, and they are doing that in all of our world's greatest cities right now. And the reason why I'm talking about cities is that I was quite surprised when I was invited to speak here today. The work that I do is mostly with citizens in my city, trying to engage them in local politics, and here I am talking to you at a global strategy forum. But I actually think that there is a lot for us to learn, not only about how we develop and how we actually create a narrative for what a successful society looks like, but also for how we make decisions and involve or choose not to involve people in those decisions. There's a lot for us to learn on both of these sides from cities. Our greatest cities are today focus of dynamic economic growth, focuses of actual pursuit of happiness in a way. People come to cities because they want to be together, they want to be in proximity with each other, they want to share and learn from each other. But at the same time, our cities are becoming more and more siloed, and they look less like the big public spaces that we imagine or that we may want to have, and more like a juxtaposition of private spaces. And people care more about their houses and their cars and their private shopping malls, and that is true not only in the United States, but increasingly, sadly, all over the developing world, where the sort of American way of developing a city has taken hold. And some of the mistakes that the United States has made and it's now trying to correct in its urban development are being repeated over and over again in those big cities that are creating car-centric, private space-centric modes of urban development. And that is a problem, and I think that's something, there is a space definitely for the US to lead because you have some of the great thinking around urban development, and also because you have made all of those mistakes already. But you've also made many, many things really well. And some of the world's greatest cities are, of course, right here in this country. But one thing that strikes me really deeply is how far away people are from city politics. You would think that at the city level, people would be more engaged in politics, right? Because decisions that are made by mayors and city administrations affect people really closely, really quickly, and right there in their communities, in their neighborhoods. But in fact, people are disengaging from city politics a lot faster than they are disengaging from national politics. Both phenomena are problematic, but at the city level, voter turnout rates, for instance, are systematically lower than at the national level, everywhere. And if we know that cities that are the front lines of some of the world's biggest problems, the fact that people are not participating in the solution, that they're not engaging in politics at the city level should be worrisome to us all, especially if we want to make sure that we live in vibrant, democratic societies. Another space, I think, for the US to lead. So that should be a big red flag in our minds. And what I have been trying to do about it is actually help people organize and self-organize in their local communities. So about 3 years ago, I co-founded an organization called Meu Rio, which works in the city of Rio in my hometown and is now expanding to other cities in the region. And what we do is provide people with technology and ways of working to make it easier for them to connect with each other, identify common issues and areas of interest, and actually make demands on their government, but also discover the power that they have with each other. So I say that we work with power with and power over. How do you actually organize to have leverage over decision-making? How do you exert power over someone or over an institution? But at the same time, how do you build power with? How do you realize your potential? I come from a city where entire communities were built from people and by people from the ground up. If you go to a slum in Rio, there is not one single piece of public infrastructure that was put in place by the government. And yet, people feel like they have no power without the government. So what we've been trying to do is actually show people that they have power with each other, and that sometimes they can use that power to influence decision-making processes when they're feeling disengaged and when they're feeling like they have no seat in the room. We are a member-driven organization. And our members are also our biggest supporters, including financially. We have 200,000 registered members in the city of Rio now, and about half of them are 20 to 29-year-olds. That means that 1 in 10 20 to 29-year-olds in the city of Rio is a member of Meu Rio today. And we think that that model is actually relevant to other cities around the world, but even if it weren't, there is something about working with youth in a country where there is the first generation that in a way didn't really have to fight for anything, or so we are told. Right? I come from the first generation of Brazilian citizens that were born under a democracy. and that spent most of their lives in a country that was growing economically really quickly. And we were told growing up that we didn't really care about democracy and we didn't really care about our democratic institutions because we did not have to fight for them. That is certainly true of all generations alive in this country, because you were fortunate enough to be born under democracy too. But that doesn't mean that we don't care about it. It just means that we're not necessarily comfortable with the way the institutions were developed. And that is something that we have to think about. People are just tired of only being treated as powerful citizens when it's time to take that power and give it to someone else. And that's exactly how we treat most of our constituencies and the general public in the US, in Brazil, and in many of our competitive democracies. We only look at people as thinking, able, powerful individuals when we're actually pleading with them and asking them to please give us their vote. And that is a problem, and that's why people are disengaging. It's not that hard, actually, to understand. Why would you be a part of a system that only cares about you in a transactional way? And after that transaction is done, that system doesn't really see you unless you are able to leverage enough power to be influential. So we could have just like sat around and said, well, we'll then disengage from that system. We won't really play by these rules. But what we're trying to do instead is actually organize the unorganized so they can actually start yielding enough power to be influential. And that means having access to the best professionals, having enough resources to have PR, design, communication, strategy, but also means recognizing each other, seeing each other, and understanding our common challenges, and understanding that some of our biggest challenges will not be solved unless we work truly together. Because cities, like our entire world, are complex systems, and if there is one part of a city that is not doing well, that is excluded from public life, and then has terrible natural environments, that will have an impact on the entire city in time. And we can try to hide from it, we can try to disengage from public space altogether, and make sure that our own little private spaces are safe and clean and good to live in. But ultimately, we are living together because we want to be together. And if the precondition for that existence becomes hiding from each other, we just won't be happy. So as we talk about imagining solutions, I would like to invite you to imagine a world in which people are participating in politics from the ground up, from the city to the national level, every single day of their lives. And not just because we have an awareness campaign, people don't want to be aware of things that they cannot change. They are engaged in politics because they know that their voice is powerful and meaningful and will have an impact. And we can start doing that in our cities right now. And I firmly believe that if we do, that will change the way our democratic societies are organized, and that will one day change the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was really great. There's a lot to comment on that, but I'll wait till we hear from all the speakers. David Rothkopf, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Nice to see you all. This is a good subject to talk about. It's a good subject to talk about because we are at a moment of strategic crisis in Washington. We may hear that strategy happens in certain places in Washington, but it doesn't really. What we do is we react. We deal with narrow-minded political issues. We don't think of the long term. We don't have the right people thinking of the long term. The institutions within the United States government that are created in order to develop strategy have atrophied or are failing at their jobs. The leaders who should be guiding us towards strategy are not strategic, or they are unable to govern effectively and therefore not able to implement the strategy, and therefore we seem to be adrift. And I think we can drill down in several areas of this. But before we do, I'd like to suggest that I've been saying this for a while. I just wrote a book that deals with this problem recently called national insecurity. And that deals a lot with the process and a lot with the look at specific government agencies and specific people. So I'm not going to deal with that here. I've also heard some rebuttals that said, oh, no, we have a strategy. You know, the president came into office and he said, well, first we're going to fix our economy and then we're going to fix our international alliances. That's not a strategy. Okay, in the first sense, it's a reaction. In the second sense, it's a strategic fragment. It doesn't deal, as Peter suggested, one ought to be dealing with the objective on the horizon, the environment that is affecting us to get in our process towards it. And I think there are reasons for that that go far beyond the people that we've got in office, far beyond the politics of Washington today or the dysfunction of Washington today, far beyond the fact that the parts of our government that once did foresight don't do foresight. And it gets to something much, much deeper and more basic. And that's what I'd like to deal with just in the course of the next 10 minutes. On September 11th, 2001, when we were attacked and we underwent a massive shift in our strategy and our international objectives, there were, according to the intelligence community estimate, 100 members of core al-Qaeda. And our immediate reaction was to treat them as though they were analogous to the Soviet Union. We immediately, because we sustained a big, shocking body blow, reorganized our national security apparatus from top to bottom. We underwent the biggest reorganization of our national security apparatus since 1947. We changed, we created the DNI, the Counterterrorism Center. We created the Department of Homeland Security. We shifted our focus to dealing with counterterrorism as a central objective. And although any president would have and should have responded to those attacks and recognized that in today's world, small groups can reach from far away and cause us problems, and we need to deal with the root causes of those problems and with those small groups, we made a terrible mistake. We began to focus on the wrong thing. The terror threat was real, but narrow. And the world was changing in fundamental ways, profound ways that would affect the United States and its role in the world and all of our national interests, and we stopped focusing on those things. Part of it's the rise of emerging powers. Part of it's the hollowing out of our own economy. That's not to be minimized. We don't know how to create jobs. We don't know how to raise wages in the United States. The old formulas don't work. The last 15 years are the first 15 years in American history where GDP goes up, productivity goes up, and wages don't grow up. And jobs have effectively held flat. And that creates not hollowing out. That creates inequality, growing gaps, political unrest, crucial issues. And while we say we've addressed our economic problems at home, we haven't addressed those things. We don't have an answer for those things. So those are important things. But I think bigger things are afoot. When I talk to groups of people and I say, what are the biggest strategic changes that have happened? What are the biggest things that have changed the world in the past 25 years? Depending on the age of the group, half of them will say 9/11, and the other half of them will say the fall of the Soviet Union. Neither of those things were the biggest changes that happened in the world in the past 25 years. The biggest change was that in 1990, there were 12 million cell phones in the world. And as of last October, there were more cellular devices on the planet than there were people. That today, there are 20 billion or so devices attached to the internet. By 2020, there will be 50 billion devices attached to the internet. Now this is not, you may think, well, that's interesting. We have Google and Facebook and Twitter, and look at the screens over here. There's Twitter stuff happening all the time. That's what that technological change means. That's not what that technological change means. It means that every aspect of life is impacted in profound ways. We are at the very, very beginning of the information revolution. What happens in the next 20 years is going to make what happened in the past 20 years seems like nothing. In fact, the way I characterize it is, this is the day before the beginning of the Renaissance. This is the day before the beginning of a massive change in human history that we have not begun to grapple with. Because all of these changes change what is human identity. Who am I? Do I associate with the people who are close to me? Or do I associate with people who are like me on the internet? Geography no longer becomes a primary identifier of who I am as a human being. Affinity does. That's profound change. Changes the nature of what is a community. That changes the nature of what is governance. What is a society? How do we connect to one another? Fundamental human rights change. Today, in today's world, you cannot get an education, get a job, conduct business transactions, compete, grow without being on the internet. Does that mean if you were writing a constitution today, that within that constitution you would say you are guaranteed right to access to the internet? I think it does, okay? But if you're guaranteed right to the access to the internet, does that mean you're guaranteed right to the access to electricity? 1.2 billion people on the planet don't have access to electricity. If they don't have access to electricity, they are not citizens. They are not being granted the rights of global citizens. Well, you might think electricity is a luxury, but it's not a luxury. It's essential in this new reality, and a lot of people are left out of that. Bigger changes are afoot. Today, 2.2 billion people on the planet don't have access to financial services, a bank. So what's going to happen to those people? Well, look to Tanzania, where 10 million people have mobile money as their means of accessing a bank account. We might think, well, that's interesting, mobile money, there's going to be bank accounts, and that's going to be a headache for banks because telecom companies are going to compete with them. And yes, that's true, and that's going to be a headache for governments because telecom regulators know nothing about banking, and banking regulators know nothing about telecom. And so we are going to have a problem in sort of dealing with this. Yes, that's true. But it's much deeper than that. I had a group of central bank governors together over at Foreign Policy a little bit ago, and those central bank governors said that this is the biggest change that has happened to finance since the advent of paper money. It's going to change what monetary policy is, what governments control, how they deliver their services. Mobile money is a game changer. We talk about cyber warfare and we talk about cyber defense or cyber. We don't have the fundamental understanding of what that means. During the Cold War, conflict was so costly that we didn't dare fight a war. In this new period, which you might call Cool War, conflict is so cheap, no one dares stop. Is that a safer world? Is it a safer world where people are constantly fighting with each other behind the scenes? Of course it's not. Because even though you do not have the nuclear threat looming, you have tensions rising. People think they can act with impunity. But ultimately, they don't act with impunity, and we have not seen the beginning of what cyber conflict really looks like. We have not seen somebody shut down an air traffic network or a power grid, and we will see it. We have not seen somebody shut down a stock market. And you know what's going to happen the day after one of those things happen? I guarantee it. You will have the Cyber Patriot Act. You will all of a sudden have a Congress that has been sitting on its behind doing what it does best right now, which is nothing, responding with a whole bunch of draconian measures that will impact privacy, impact how the economy works. Think about it. Nobody at the NSA was sitting there going, gee, if we go and scoop up all of these phone calls, we may blow up the internet. But that's precisely what they did. Because the reaction to the revelations that came out with Snowden was that countries around the world said, we're not playing anymore in this game. In Brazil, the Brazilian government said, we're not going to buy software from US companies to connect our government to other people. It cost Microsoft $1 billion, just that one decision. But they also said, we're going to get together with other people. We're going to create an internet backbone of our own. We don't want to be on the US internet backbone. And it fueled something in other countries that we decry today. We say, oh, look at the Chinese. They're trying to control their internet. That's not the vision we had of the internet that takes down borders and opens things up and connects the world. But you want to know what it is? For them, it's the future and it's their natural right as sovereigns. And so in China, the Great Firewall of China is an extension of an ideology that might be adopted by people. In fact, our cyber internationalism is now being confronted by cyber nationalism. It is leading to a balkanization of the internet. Well, that's not just relevant to Google. The vast majority of economic activity on the planet takes place on the internet. Social activity, political activity, military activity, it takes place on the internet. But we don't have even the fundamentals we need to formulate strategy about this. In the 1950s, if you went into the government, you were going into a national security job, you had to speak throw weight. You had to know what nuclear policy was. But today, at the highest levels of government, people don't understand cyber. They don't understand the new technologies. They don't understand the implications of big data. Big data changes everything. Everything. Every company on the stock exchange is undervalued. Because every company has a data asset. Because every company is gathering data from sensors and everything that it makes or does or has. That data asset shows up on not one balance sheet. The data liabilities show up nowhere. We can't have a discussion about this if people aren't trained to do it, if they don't understand it. And when we have a discussion in Washington about issues that involve science and technology, what we get is a glazed expression. When Mike Hayden went in and he briefed people in the early days of the cyber threat, he said people looked back at him like he was Rain Man. Okay? And that's because we're not doing science and technology in Washington. I did a study of the top 10 think tanks in Washington for 10 years. Everything that they did, every event, every document, study, everything they did, 12,000 items. By far the least represented was science and technology with 150 items out of 12,000 over 10 years. The think tanks aren't thinking. Now, we know why, right? Think tanks actually don't do thinking. Atlantic Council notwithstanding, the best of all the think tanks. But most think tanks are meat lockers, where we store bureaucrats in case we need them later on in the future, okay? They're not taking those risks, and most of the people in those think tanks were trained in social sciences, and they were trained in old models. And we're entering a new model world, where war and peace and economics and monetary policy and governance and human rights, the nature of a society, the nature of a community, the nature of an individual is changing much more rapidly than we understand. We're not having a dialogue. We don't even have the philosophical underpinnings. It was 320 years from Gutenberg to the First Amendment. During that time, we had a few little discussions about it. We had the benefit of John Locke and the Glorious Revolution. We had the benefit of trying to understand whether the First Amendment was important and how it would affect our society. Tell me the last time you sat in some grove with a bunch of philosophers. You know, well, perhaps you did. But the reality is it's not happening for most people in most places. We need the philosophical underpinnings. We need leaders who are trained in science and technology. We need think tanks in Washington that are thinking about it. We need foresight organizations that have the capability and the bandwidth and the mission to deal with these things, and we need to recognize that it's not terrorism, it's not today's politics, it's not the temporal issues that are going to affect U.S. interests most profoundly over the course of the next decades or affect the global interests most profoundly. It's these other factors which require different people and a different conversation. Thanks very much for allowing me to share these thoughts.
That was great, David. That's a tough one to follow, I gotta say. Cool War. That's I don't know if you've heard that one before. I hadn't, but that's a keeper. Cool War. So we've gone from Cold War to Hot War to Cool War. I have to play with that one. Okay, our next two and final two speakers are going to speak together. Josh Marcuse and Zvika Krieger. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. That's a tough act to follow. I guess we'll wait for our slides to show up. There we go.
It's good. That's a
one more screen. 1, 2, 3. There we go. So my name is Zvika Krieger. I'm a senior advisor for policy at the State Department, and I run the Political Military Strategy Office over there. Next slide, Zvika. Is our slide? Let's see.
Well, while we're getting that working, my name is Joshua Marcuse. I'm a senior advisor for policy innovation in OSD Policy. And we throw these slides up here to show where we are. And the key thing to take away from this is that we are very, very small cogs in vast machines. And we say that as a caveat because what we're saying represents our views and certainly not that of almost everyone that we work with.
And part of our jobs in these vast bureaucracies is to think about how we can bring innovation to places that are generally hamstrung by conventional wisdom, bureaucracies, processes, and the same way of doing things for years and years, if not decades. And so in our capacities as innovation consultants, as we're often referred to, we've come out with a number of observations. I think we're having some trouble with this. There we go. We've come up with a number of observations as to how one might drive solutions in government. The title of this session is called Imagining Solutions, and so we've really canvassed the field, whether it's in all across government, and thought about what are the ways in which government approaches solutions in trying to address some of our biggest challenges.
Thanks very much, Zvika. So we're going to run these through rapid fire, 7 important ideas that we've distilled from observing what we think many leaders are doing now in the national security establishment. First and foremost, we've seen the importance of thinking big, of having big and bold, innovative ideas that are as significant as the challenges that we face. Second, we know the importance of starting with the end in mind, having that goal focus and that goal orientation, and knowing now where we're trying to go and having that clear and efficient linear path from the present to the future. We know it's important to measure twice and cut once, to have precision and accuracy, and make sure that we're not making the mistakes that we need to. I know.
I know what's wrong with this slide. There we go. There you go.
Measure twice and cut once. Right, we knew that it's critically important to understand all the technical information and the detail and to prepare and to plan and to make sure that our solutions really are measured out to face the challenges that we need. And as we do that, we know that how critical it is to be bold and to be decisive and to make decisions and to stick to them and to have certainty about the direction that we need to go in and not to shy away from these immense challenges that we need to face in this increasingly complex and changing world that David described for you. We know that it's important to focus on the solution, that we have all these new and emerging technologies that give us this unprecedented power, and we need to make sure that we're using the best technologies that we have to come up with the most intricate and complex solutions that are equal to the complexity of the problems they're trying to solve. And we also know the importance of trusting in experts. Here we are in this think tank filled with people that have dedicated their lives to amassing a vast amount of technical expertise in their specific region or function. And we know how important it is to incorporate this expertise into the decision-making process, the planning process, into the strategic planning process. And last, and I'm so glad that David mentioned it, we need to leverage data analytics. We're right now essentially drifting in a sea of data, And we need to understand how to use that data to make better choices. And we believe there's so much promise in big data and big data analytics.
So saw a lot of you nodding your head. I'm sure you've come across these and seen their power and utility in government and confronting our complex challenges. The problem is that all of these principles are wrong. These are the principles. Oh, I heard a yes in the background. Hopefully you didn't see that we were baiting you. These principles, there are definitely times where they are useful and where they are important, but they also are not the full story. They're not what we need to engage with and counter the complexity and the challenges of the world that we face today. So instead of thinking big, how about thinking small? How about narrowing down on what are actually the genuine needs that we're trying to address with our policies? Instead of starting with the end in mind, how about starting in the unknown? How about thinking, not knowing where you're going to end up, but being willing to learn through the policymaking process? Instead of measure twice and cut once, instead of being very deliberative and only putting a policy or a program out there and when you know that it's perfect, why don't you start with a rough prototype, learn from your experience, and iterate from that? Instead of being bold and decisive and picking that one idea you're going to put out there, place lots of small bets, spread the risk, and see what works in the real world. Instead of just focusing on the solution, find the right problem. Sometimes we're spending all this energy and getting spun up on what's actually the wrong problem to begin with. Leveraging data and analytics is important, but we need to complement that with human insight and experience, real world, on the ground, what's happening, really broadening our perspectives. And with experts are important, but if we keep going back to the same well, if we keep opening that meat locker, as David pointed out, we're just going to be coming up with the same idea. So let's broaden the pool of the people that we talk to and the people that we include in the policy-making process.
So the danger that we have, that we face, that each of us face every day working in government, is that when we have leaders that are applying the first set of principles, which on face appear to be quite dynamic, inspiring, and encouraging, it leads us to a path that is fundamentally disconnected from the people whose needs we're trying to meet, from the problems we're trying to solve, and from the decisions that we're trying to make. What we experience so often is the following meeting. We see there's a leader at the head of the room. He or she is coming in with a set of assumptions and premises of what they believe the right answer is. They're surrounded by people whose job it is primarily to staff that leader. The meeting begins. The leader spends a considerable amount of time stating what they believe the problem is, and then a small number of the people in the room get to say something. Usually, they're the people that are both formally at the top of the hierarchy and informally at the top of the hierarchy. We know this is a system that is biased towards men, especially white men, towards extroverts, towards people who are physically taller, towards all these things that are exogenous to the value and quality of the ideas that they have. And when they're not talking to tell the leader what the leader probably wants to hear, they're planning their rebuttal to what the other person is about to say. Most of the people in the room never get to say a word. Many voices are silenced. Many perspectives are excluded. And we think that that's one of the reasons why we are having the problems that we're having. What we want to suggest is that there is a totally different way to make decisions, to gather information, to consider alternatives. And we want to present that idea to you today. This is the solution.
This is what we are going to present to you today. The solution lies in a very complex, high-tech piece of hardware that is used all across the private sector, but which is actually quite forward-leaning and cutting-edge within the federal government, has taken years of expertise to hone, and the solution is this, a Post-it note. So the Post-it note, how can a stack of Post-it notes solve the problems that we've been talking about today, or at least show us a new way of thinking about it? Post-it notes are the primary tool in an approach that's called design thinking, which is something that came out of the private sector, which has historically been more about product design and service design. And Josh and I, along with a number of other forward-leaning folks across government, have been thinking about, can we take the best principles of design thinking and apply them to policymaking?
This is a gift for you, Fred. You guys are doing a lot of innovative work here at the Atlantic Council. I know you'll use these sticky notes very well. So, what are the advantages of this design thinking approach? The first is that it's all about continually framing and reframing the problem. We spend more time asking ourselves whether we have the right question than talking about whether we have the right answer. And what we found is that this has led to a chain reaction, a domino effect of encouraging leaders to think about different kinds of questions and explore different solutions. And often, within a couple of hours, we can find out that the question that was brought to us by our leaders was not in fact the question that they really wanted to ask, and we bring them a set of solutions and alternatives in addition to the one they asked for that gets us a lot closer to solving the root cause of the issue at hand. It leads to a fundamentally different set of questions and a more creative approach. Synthesizing diverse perspectives and disciplines. This is a great way to bring in outside perspectives, invite them into the conversation, include a diversity of points of view. In contrast to the meeting that I described, this is a way for everyone to contribute their ideas, and not just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 ideas, but we've literally run sessions where we've generated hundreds of ideas in an hour or less. And under these circumstances, it's totally anonymous, egalitarian, rankless, so the best ideas filter to the top automatically. We use these tools and techniques to gather deep stakeholder insight. Instead of focusing on the memo or the talking points or the paper, we're actually spending most of our time doing ethnographic research with the users. We're actually talking to the people that are the consumers and the implementers of the policy, as well as many other stakeholders in this system or ecosystem of ideas that have a point of view on this, and we find ways to bring them into the conversation. And it facilitates a radical degree of collaboration. We bring in all these different people and all their different voices and use these different techniques, visual thinking and metaphor and facilitation and even improv and all these other different approaches from across all human disciplines, and we bring them together to be part of these conversations.
One of the most salient features of design thinking is it flattens hierarchies, which means that it's not about who's the most important person in the room, but who has the best ideas. Of course, this is government, so the flattening is only temporary, but it's temporary in the sense that it flattens hierarchies for the sake of the idea generation and the creative process. We also, as Josh mentioned, have design thinking has tools to generate lots of creative solutions, to take what we've learned through stakeholder engagement and bringing in those diverse perspectives and turning them into many creative solutions. Then there's also tools to take those hundreds of ideas that Josh talked about and to prioritize strategically, whether that's by feasibility or by impact or difficulty or other metrics that we've set out. We know how to choose from this vast collection of creativity that we've facilitated. And then a key component of design thinking is that you need to iterate rapidly. You need to fail fast, cheap, and smart. You need to take an idea and instead of polishing it and polishing and polishing it and coordinating it, as we say in the State Department, you actually get it out there as fast as possible, see what works, see what doesn't, and do it again, even better and as rapidly as possible. So those are just some of the concepts that design thinking helps enables, and there's a whole toolbox of things that the private sector has been using for years that we're just starting to apply to government. And so you might be thinking, okay, sounds great, sounds pretty abstract, but does this actually work? What kind of problems have you applied it to? And between Josh and I, we've probably led dozens, if not more, different sessions and different processes trying to pilot out design thinking for policy making. So we'll go through, just quickly give you a taste of some of the issues that we've tackled.
We worked with a group of 100 strategists from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We brought them in different groups. We did A/B testing of different ideas. Here's a group of people that are tackling the question of how should DoD assess risk. Here's one we did with the White House for the Joining Forces Initiative on rethinking how the White House can best support veterans when they return. This is us in the EEOB, and you can see there's a lot of different people all working on different sets there. We did one on mitigating cognitive bias in the defense planning process and how to better leverage red teams. This is a picture taken from an innovation lab in the basement of the Office of Personnel Management.
This is a session that we did about how we can improve State Department input into the DoD plans and operations, working with 100 foreign policy advisors, senior foreign service officers that embed within the military commands. Just yesterday, Josh and I actually spent a few days working with a group of folks from DoD and the State Department to redesign how we build our partners' militaries, how we, the whole process for your U.S. security assistance. And lastly, actually, a few weeks ago, we led a session right here in this exact room. You might recognize that pillar. It's right over there. With the Atlantic Council Young Leaders Group, the Millennium Leadership Group, on how to reform NATO to meet 21st century security challenges. And so that's just a small sampling of different projects that we've used, different challenge sets that we've tackled, and using these tools, we've been able to generate really creative and out-of-the-box ideas that matches the complexity of the challenges. And so, just to end our presentation, our real philosophy behind this is that you can't come up with new ideas using the same old tools, having the same old people in the room. To quote, it's always safe to end a presentation on innovation quoting Albert Einstein, who said, "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." So really what we're encouraging here is breaking out of the box, looking at things from new ways, because the challenges that we face in the future demand new thinking, new ideas, new stakeholders, new perspectives. And so we hope that by bringing new tools to the table, we can really help bring some new ideas into the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yep. So we still have time for a few questions and comments. That was terrific in 3 different directions, like you, Alessandra, I find the future of cities really interesting. Most of the world will be in cities by the middle of the century, and cities actually solve problems. There was a terrific book published last year, If Mayors Ran the World, by Ben Barber, right? And he makes the point that, you know, it's actually the mayors who solve the day-to-day problems of life, education, infrastructure, environment, and so on. Our strategy as a company is focused on the 50 biggest cities in the world rather than the 7 biggest nations in the world, because that's where the economy is growing, where innovation is happening. So I see that as a very important set of ideas. And like you, the way of rethinking the model of cities is also coming out of the United States. An architect named Peter Calthorpe reinventing the design of cities and the new urbanism. Do you see these ideas taking hold as you talk about them around the world?
Absolutely. I was actually just at Oxford at a panel with Ben Barber, and we discussed this at length. I think that there's more and more stakeholders recognizing the importance of cities. I think there's less people recognizing the importance of citizens. So that's something that we still need to fight for. I don't want to live in a world where mayors rule the world, and I told Ben Barber that. Although I do think that mayors should have more power and bigger budgets and more decision-making power in general. But I also think that we need to keep them accountable. And oftentimes it is at the city level that mafias and other kinds of, not very interesting groups that yield a lot of power have the most influence because they're very close to home. It's very hard to sort of keep a mayor outside of that terrible political environment sometimes, unless people are knocking on his or her door. And one thing that also came up when I was speaking with him is that oftentimes the right mayor wants to do the right thing, but there is no political space for it. And there is an element of making them do it, right? Like when you want to advance social change, and that is true in cities, that is true outside of cities too, sometimes you have to rely on allies inside of government, like many of you are, but you also have to give them the political space to do whatever it is that you want them to do, and that often comes from organizing people effectively. So when they're negotiating internally, they can say, this is not me trying to create a change, this is the 20,000 people outside of my door, right? And that changes the conversation internally as well.
David. So, like you, I think we got it wrong after 9/11. We passed the Bin Laden tax, which was the biggest tax increase in U.S. history. We pay it every time we go through the airport. Every single citizen pays it. Most of the world pays the Bin Laden tax. We taxed ourselves, or we didn't actually tax, we borrowed a couple $1 trillion that we're going to have to pay off to pay the Bin Laden tax. Somehow or other, we got ourselves really twisted sideways about this. There were big challenges. And it was important, but somehow or other, like you, I have this sense that it so changed our consciousness that it has distorted U.S. politics, global politics in ways that were thoroughly wrong-headed. But you introduced an idea that I think we have to follow up on. So what's the strategy that's the equivalent of containment for the Cool War?
Well, I don't think there is, I mean, containment was a strategy that was directed at a country. And we still have containment challenges around the world. I think part of, a successful Iran strategy will involve containing the threats they pose regionally, even as we try to engage them where we can engage them. So I think we'll continue to do that. I think, first of all, we have to recognize the nature of Cool War, and we then have to recognize where the threats are coming from and how do we deal with them. We're not at that point yet. I mean, we don't have fundamental doctrine, right? Can you respond to a cyber attack with a kinetic response? We don't have fundamental elements of response. So, for example, we don't have a deterrence. The White House has announced a deterrence policy, which is, it's a sham. I mean, the policy turns on naming and shaming, which is proven to be extremely effective in Mrs. Smith's first grade class when somebody steals a cookie.
Yeah, Kim Jong-un doesn't seem to be deterred by that.
Right, and nor will Vladimir Putin or other people be. We have to figure out what actually deters people from undertaking these kind of attacks. We're not there yet. We also need to understand what our strategic tools and objectives are. So, for example, in traditional war, in total war, the objective was to destroy the enemy. In Cool War, the objective may be just to give your opponent a low-grade infection, right? Just bring them down a couple of points. Just shave a bit off of GDP. Just shut down this component in their social development. We're not there yet. And the players are just lining up on the field. So you don't have a strategy, of containment unless you have an enemy that needs to be contained. I can tell you this, we probably shouldn't fall into the same traps we did before where the United States thinks it can handle everything unilaterally. There are probably international mechanisms that will help us do this better. There is no way to do it with the public sector alone. The private sector is the primary target in these attacks, the primary knowledge holder in terms of the tools that are available to us, the primary whistleblower to announce that an attack has happened. Right now, they don't seem to be willing to do that in most cases. So you need international mechanisms, public-private mechanisms, understanding at the top level, understanding of who's on the player, before we can even get to answering questions like the one you just asked.
I'm going to warn Carl Bildt, because I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Minister, in a moment. For those of you who don't know, Carl chaired a commission on the future of the internet, and I'd like you to respond to the same question, what you might think about strategy for Cool War, because I know something that you are deeply engaged in and very significant. Gentlemen, design thinking, I totally agree. I helped create something called scenario planning that builds on that same idea. We use it in our software development. So what's the likelihood that actually, we saw a lovely number of sessions there. I'm very familiar with the processes. I'm actually a fellow of the Design Council. By everything you're saying, is it actually happening? Are people, you think it's going to change the practices and norms of engagement and creativity within the government?
Yes.
Say more.
I would say that yes.
What happens when you guys leave? No, I'm serious. What happens when you guys leave?
Sure.
Is anybody going to follow up on this,
Sure.
or are you two creative engines that will just disappear and all this will fade away?
Real quick, and then Zvika's turn. My background was actually in change management before it was in design. And so at the moment that we recognized the value of this, we began thinking about how to change the institutions and how to shape the people within it. So actually, we created what we call a design and innovation practice, where there are 50 people that have been trained in these methods. And our focus is how do we build leaders and advocates throughout the organization and spread those little islands of practitioners throughout the building. So we are being very intentional on trying to figure out how to seed this throughout, but obviously I recognize it's going to be a challenge. It's a challenge now, and it will continue to be an uphill slog for us.
I will say that, you know, in the world of national security, the way to show that an idea has really arrived is to see if it makes its way into a departmental strategy document. And I tried hard, but to no avail, to get it into the QDR, which came out last year when I worked in the strategy office in OSD policy. However, I'm proud to report that the QDDR, which is the State Department's Quadrennial Review, which came out yesterday, does have an entire section on design thinking and the need to use tools like design thinking to be more innovative. And we actually have a community of practice at the State Department working with Deputy Secretary for Management and folks all across the building. And actually, there are folks all across government that are doing this in departments ranging from Health and Human Services to the Office of Personnel Management to the Veterans Affairs. And so while I think maybe a year ago it would have been correct to describe it as an insurgency or a small group of creative people, it's really catching on because people see the utility. And it's not just because of the quality of the solutions that we're creating, but also in the engagement. And if we're going to want to retain people within the workforce, millennials, people from the creative class, people from Silicon Valley, the people that we need to solve some of the threats that were talked about earlier, they demand these kind of tools in how they operate. So I think that there are definitely corners of resistance, and we can talk about that later if people are interested, but we've been, I'd say even we have been surprised at how quickly this has been taken on and on a broad level within the bureaucracies.
Great. Mr. Minister, so, yeah, take the mic. Cold War. You and I immediately grabbed that phrase when we were sitting there.
Well, it was a good phrase. We're going to steal it and use it.
Right.
Because I do think...
Feel free.
Yeah, quite cool war or cool conflicts. Because war is still a word that sort of for us it's big tank battles and armadas and whatever. Cool conflicts. That is what we are heading into. And I very much agree with what you said on sort of the word of hyperconnectivity and what it really means. Within 5 years, 90% of the population of the world will be covered by networks, mobile broadband networks with a capacity higher than we have in most of Europe today. And I would argue for the digital divide debate that the big digital divide across the world is going to be the generational one. Virtually all young people, the poorest village in the poorest parts of Africa, will have a mobile device that connects him or her to the world. And their parents won't have a clue what's going on. So this will change quite a lot. And then, this is 5 years from now. If you take a further 5 years, and we see the 5G networks that aren't in existence, but we see them coming, they have a capacity of at least 100, factor 100, for these particular networks. And then it starts to be really mind-boggling. And then the biggest resources for development that's going to be competition over is going to be, as we said, data and spectrum. Data and spectrum are going to be the key resources. How to utilize them for nations and business and for others. And as said, conflicts of all sorts are going to be played out there. Conflicts between generations, between nations, between business, between others. And for us now, to go back to where we are, extremely important to safeguard the open, secure, and safe nature of this particular network. And it is under threat. It was interesting that the Pentagon published the other day a strategy for cyber something. I haven't read it, but it was out there 3 or 4 days ago. But I notice now that those that have read it and had an official commentary today is the Chinese government. And that's important in itself. No other government that I know have even read it or noticed it. But the Chinese government has read it, analyzed it, and is commenting upon them. And for them, cyber strategies is even more important than for any other nations, both for defensive reasons, the security of the regime, and for the economic development of the country. And we need to take these issues far more seriously than they are taking in the strategy debates all over the world, I would say, with the possible exception of China.
Peter, can I just interject just 30 seconds? If there's one thing that I want to leave you with, it follows directly on what Carl Bildt said. Within the next few years, for the first time in human history, every single human being on the planet will effectively be connected in a man-made system.
Yep.
That is transformational at the most fundamental level. The second thing that I'd like to say, apropos of those remarks, is we suffer in the United States from national narcissism. We think everything centers around us, and that the way we've seen things is the way we're going to see things. And when we mention the Chinese jumping on this and being ahead of the curve, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that throughout human history, the economic center of gravity has also been the place of the intellectual center of gravity, and it shifted from Europe to the United States, and it is surely going to shift to Europe, and it surely is going to shift to Asia. And if you think for a moment that just because we see the internet some way, that's the way this is all going to evolve, it's a mistake. They have a lot of people, a lot of countries that agree in this with their philosophy, which is radically different from our philosophy. Meanwhile, Europe has a completely different philosophy on privacy than we do, which is likely to catch on broadly in the world. There is a debate going on about these things that's going to affect a broad number of things, and we're not affecting it. The final point I'd like to say is I spoke 3 or 4 weeks ago at the TED conference, which was very interesting, and it's very refreshing to go to a conference where people are talking about solutions as opposed to problems. In other words, go to a conference outside of Washington. But there was a philosopher, and he only works with artificial intelligence specialists. And he got a group of artificial intelligence specialists together, and he said, when do you think it will be that we have machine intelligence that has real autonomy associated with it? And some of them said 2030, and some said 2040, and some said 2050, and a few said 2060. None of them said another century. None of them said 200 years from now. Within a generation, machines will have autonomy. And you may think, oh, the Terminator movie, that's an abstraction. This is not an abstraction. It changes those, by then 100 billion devices on the internet will be acting as independent agents. And that is also something that will change the nature of life on the planet, because there'll be human-machine interface at a societal level, not at a utilitarian level as the way that we've had it thus far. So,
well, look, I was user number 70 of the ARPANET before it became the internet. It was I was at Stanford Research Institute,
Dixie
number
cups
2.
and strings at that.
Pretty close, but we were node number 2 of the ARPANET. And I think the vision that we had then is now actually being fulfilled, of a highly interconnected world. And like you, I think that is really the single biggest and profound change. But you are way too conservative in terms of your view of the future of AI. We will be introducing a product this fall, our company, that is basically event-driven AIs. And this is in marketing and sales, very trivial activity. We're not launching any weapons, but basically an autonomous intelligence will read an event and launch an action based on that without any human intervention. It's not big AI, it's little AI, a little bit of intelligence applied in a lot of places. So that world is already here. September, and we're not unique. There'll be a lot of companies doing what we do.
Just quoting a guy.
Yeah, it's already there. Let me ask, do we have time for any questions or comments from the audience? Okay, so let's take those 3 and get them all up here, and then we'll ask everyone to respond. Not you? You've changed your mind? Okay, right here, and then right over here. How are we doing on time? Pardon me? Okay. Floor is yours. Yep, here's your mic.
Magic. Good. I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. This discussion was very interesting, and it reinforces the point that we tend to focus on symptoms, not causes. September 11th, we focused on symptoms, as you pointed out. The Obama administration came in with Afghan-Pakistan strategy, symptoms, not causes. We've had Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, symptoms, not causes with the financial markets. What do you do to get elected presidents and senior members of Congress to focus on causes, not symptoms?
I'm going to ask you guys to respond to that in a moment, but we'll get this question up here first, over here. Did you have your hand up too? Okay, we'll get, do you change your mind again? Which way, are you speaking or not speaking? You're speaking, okay.
Hi, Patricia Wrights in Georgetown University. But I'm speaking with a hat that I don't really have anymore, which is I was at the National Academy of Sciences, and our last study was on human-machine collaboration for decision-making. And I have a feeling that the reason why the philosopher heard those forecasts was because they want to stay in business and they want to keep getting grants. One of my concerns about this whole conference, which I have found absolutely fascinating, is the extent to which we as non-scientists tend to believe that all these things are happening when really they're not anywhere near happening. And so I just think that I just want to put that out, that most of this science and technology around AI, around genomics, et cetera, it certainly is in research, and we certainly should be thinking about it, but it's not, there is some time to think about this.
Yeah, big AI is going to take a long time to develop, a real brain substitute. Little bits of intelligence, like one click on Amazon, that's here already. Over here, and I think that's where we're going to have to call it, I'm sorry.
Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Scott McDonald, Headquarters United States Marine Corps. I read the dynamic stability paper. It talked a lot about empowered individuals. In fact, it tended to represent them as a threat to the global security system rather than an aid to it. Interestingly enough, this is the first panel that's really talked about individuals. We've talked about systems, technologies, national policy. Here we started talking about individuals. And speaking from the premise that ideas rule the world, whether or not there's technology or not, that guy sitting in the savannah has an idea, and how he acts on that idea is going to change things. So my question to the panel is, speaking of empowered individuals and knowledge going forward, if our goal is to create a global strategy, a United States strategy for the security and prosperity of the United States, do we need to embrace the empowerment of individuals, or do we need to control them?
Okay, David, I'm going to ask you to respond to that in a moment, but I'll ask you to respond to the first comment over here.
Want to go first? Sure. You know, I'm not much of an athlete, but I've often been told, you know, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Well, I would say, in answer to your question, Harlan, you know, we answer 0% of the questions that we don't ask. And so I would say that the way that we focus more on root causes is we have to encourage more dialogue about those root causes. And I would submit that actually, I really admire the leaders we have now that are asking those questions. The challenge there is that the answers to those questions aren't focused on and elevated and given the emphasis that they need. And so my hope is that by using the design thinking methodology that we are advocating, we will create a greater demand signal for questions that focus on the root causes of things, and then that will have an effect that reverberates throughout the system. But thank you for asking that question, because it's exactly the right one.
David?
Okay, I'm going to just jump in and answer Harlan's question a little bit too. Might help if we hired people in top jobs who've actually managed something before. You know, in Washington, the greatest error we make is that we believe the notion that the ability to articulate an idea is the same thing as the ability to get something done. You know, managers tend to know this, and you know, obviously the people play a role in this, which relates to your question about empowering the individual. We don't get to choose. The individuals will be empowered, and in the world that Carl was describing, you know, with some degree of the AI and you know, 5G connections and other things at their disposal, they're going to have much, much, much more power than they have ever had. Having said that, there have been books out there that talk about the end of power, and they say, well, you know, governments aren't going to have power and so forth, and that's just crap, right? You know, if you have a lot of money and you have a lot of technology, you're going to have more power than you did before. And so we're going to see a redistribution, a diffusion, and I think the real changes we're going to see are in the character of international relations, the character of relations between any groups. They will be accelerated. Volatility will be enhanced. Effects will be amplified. Time scales will be shortened. Things will be decentralized. So, I would say, look at changes in the character, and then you're going to have to go back to the basics and say, what are our national objectives? What are the threats to those objectives? What are the means by which we achieve those objectives? And how do we do that in the environment? To go back to Peter's very elegant analogy, even though I was once a powerboat owner, which is, I do agree.
Stink pots, we call it.
Right. The two best moments in a boat owner's life are the day you buy the boat and the day you sell the boat. But the analogy is right. We've got to look at the changing environment and set our course accordingly.
I think unfortunately, we have to call it there to allow time for the final conversation. So join me in thanking the participants in this conversation.
So let me ask you, again, thank you so much for this panel. I really enjoyed this one. I know I'm a little bit biased, but I really enjoyed this one. I'm going to do two things as we rearrange the stage very quickly to keep things moving here. One is encourage you all to move to the center. We really want this to be a discussion with all of you about what you took from this particular conference that we have. Fred will be joining us in a second here with Matt Burrows, a Millennium Fellow, Ashley Godwin, Kurt Radke, one of our big supporters, and Peter, of course, will draw some threads together for you. While we're doing that, I just wanted to remind you to take a look in those cool little folders that we've put together for you. You'll see a couple of things in there that I'd like to draw your attention to. One is just a sheet of paper that talks about a strategy initiative. That strategy initiative is a larger initiative we're undertaking here at the Atlantic Council that underpins this particular conference and hopefully future ones that you'll see over time. This strategy initiative's intent is really to get strategy and strategic discussions on the forefront of public discourse, particularly as we head into actually we're not heading into, we are in the midst of the next presidential campaign. It has a number of lines of effort to include this Global Strategy Forum, to include a strategy lab that will advance the thinking on a lot of the imagining solution pieces that you've heard here, and a strategy paper series that will put out a number of papers on different aspects of strategy and strategic thinking. The first of those we released just last week. It's called Dynamic Stability. You heard it referred to at least a couple of times in this session. I think you heard a lot of its themes really reinforced over and over again in many, many of these discussions, and hope you'll hear a little bit more. That paper is also included in your package. Please take a look at it. We think it's important because we think it really emphasizes the need to think differently about world affairs and not really to just look backwards for historic analogies in that area. We encourage you to read it. We encourage you to comment on it. We encourage you to keep in touch with us and keep involved with us as we continue this strategy initiative far beyond just this particular Global Strategy Forum. With that, I think we're set.
I'll sit on the end.
Over to you, Fred.
Great, thank you, Dan. So I like the comment in the last panel that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and I really want to salute the Scowcroft Center staff and everybody who conceived of this Global Strategy Forum, because I think it was a shot worth taking. I think we're going to try to continue this as we try to innovate and prove to David Rothkopf that the Atlantic Council is not a place of refrigerated meat, which I thought was a really interesting comment. So you've heard a lot about change over the last couple of days, how it will continue to unfold, rapid, somewhat unpredictable pace. I think what we want to do in this panel is draw out what we think are the key takeaways from the last 2 days, also engage all of you. Anyone who's been sitting through this believes that it's a unique moment in human history. Sometimes I wonder whether every moment in human history humans have wanted to think that. And so maybe this is just unique in a different way, if that's not redundant. But yet the globalization, value change, greater financial integration, exponential advancement of technology, rapid urbanization, these are all new. The global interconnectedness of the internet, I thought that was with David Rothkopf talking about how we've gone from 12 million cell phones in 1990 to 20 billion devices hooked up to the internet now as the biggest change rather than the Cold War or 9/11. Unparalleled innovation empowered societies, individuals across the globe. But all these developments, I think we can draw that away from these 2 days as well, come at a cost. Our societies are more vulnerable to external shocks and crises. Policymakers, business leaders, social leaders all have to account for a proliferation of risks. We're actually doing some work now on whether risks are growing faster than GDP. It's a very interesting project. And these risks are areas from terrorism to social inequality, from climate change to data breaches. So you name it, there's just a lot that can go wrong in this cool war, Peter, that you drew out as a pretty nice term. So we're seeing disconnects between how international actors traditionally navigate international relations and how the globalized environment actually works and is changing. So that's a lot of challenge for our work going ahead, with a very tenuous balance between risks and opportunities. And so we hope that you'll all go away with some new ideas. And we'll continue the discussion on these things internally as our work as well. I'm going to go through the 4 sessions really quickly and give my takeaways, and then I'm going to go straight to the panelists after that, and I'll introduce them after I've gone through my takeaways, and then we'll hear their takeaways and go to Q&A right away. So in the first panel, where we had Vijay Kumar and Jamie Metzl, and of course with the inimitable Peter Schwartz in the chair seat, and just 3 bullets: we're unprepared in almost every way for the speed, scale, and novelty of tech-driven change. Number 2, and these are no way comprehensive, just some thoughts. We're entering an era where we're altering our own evolution as a species, the whole idea of genetic design. And I'm really sort of upset it's coming late, because I always wanted to be a major league pitcher. But I guess I'll have to wait for my grandchildren rather than myself. Number 3, we're reducing the barriers to entry for advanced technological development use, which will have profoundly good and bad implications. The second session, preventing failures, with August Cole and Heather Zeichel. The power of narrative is fundamental to all major strategic and policy decisions. ISIS has a narrative. Russia has a narrative. China has a narrative. It seems we lack one at the moment. And we're being out-narrated. We should encourage people who are good at envisioning narratives, even fictional ones, to participate in policy making and strategy. And then finally, the gap between what is happening to the Earth right now, climate change, and our response is enormous. The debate on America's role in the world, very lively debate. I think people loved it. Xenia Wickett and Christopher Preble. So there was agreement that the U.S. is the indispensable nation and that the global system has rested on U.S. power, in particular U.S. military power. But there was divergence about whether the U.S. ought to remain the indispensable partner. Chris said the system, because he was against that notion, the system is unsustainable. It rests on a single point of failure, very interesting point, which is the U.S. itself. And the number 2, the system will not fall apart if the U.S. helps the world transition away from reliance upon the U.S. and get other actors buying into our norms. And then 3, the American people don't want to be the indispensable power and support U.S. global security footing forever. Xenia Wickett, who in the end won the vote of the audience, argued the U.S. remains indispensable because of its incredible assets and drawing power. It's not a given that others will step up and lead. If the U.S. stops, I think we're seeing that, the vacuum being filled by less benevolent actors in disorder. And then the U.S. should lead in concert with others and be better partnering in coalitions. And then the last panel, and I won't go too much into that since most of you, I think all of you were here, but the whole notion of looking at cities, we want to do much more of that here because that's where democracy happens, that's where economy happens. That's actually where some of the most innovative leaders coming into national leadership are coming from. And we have to think much more about local to global instead of just global. David Rothkopf, other than offending all of us at think tanks by calling us refrigerated meat, I think added very much to the conversation by talking about a crisis of strategy in DC, and actually trying to help us think differently about how we have to go at strategy, dramatically differently in a different sort of world where, as I said, you have 20 billion devices set to the internet. So I thought it was a very provocative session and arguments in his place. And then finally, design thinking, which I thought was really an interesting idea, a way to end the day, where it's not just doing strategy and coming up with strategies, it's how do you change the process of getting to strategy, and then ending with Einstein, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So instead of saying, well, we have to have the solution and then work backwards, you actually have to have the process to get to the solution, and I actually like that different way of saying. So that's all I'm going to say at this point, and I want to go to our panelists, and let me introduce all four of them, and then we'll start. And you know, I don't want to be too structured here, so if you want to jump in on each other as we go down the line, let's do that. By now, I don't think we need to introduce Peter Schwartz. He's introduced himself to you. And Peter, I want to thank you, and maybe we can give Peter a round of applause for doing such a wonderful job the last 2 days. Thanks for your intellectual range and your brain power applied to this. Matt Burrows, who serves as the director of our Strategic Foresight Initiative in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. No book author wants you to introduce him without selling his book. You have to buy The Future Declassified. It's just a terrific book, really drawing from his experience as counselor to the National Intelligence Council and director of analysis and production staff, doing a lot of the national intelligence estimates coming up to the president, and the principal drafter of the NICS quadrennial publication on global trends. Kirk Radke is a member of the Executive Committee of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors, and very much has been our leader in New York of our strategy initiative. A partner at Willkie Farr and Gallagher in New York City, more than 25 years of experience handling nearly every type of private equity corporate transaction. Also a great art collector and supporter of the arts, including dance. So a real Renaissance man. And then finally, one of the newest members of our council community, the Atlantic Council's Millennium Leadership Program Fellow. There were about 800 plus people competing for 21 positions. So we really got the best and the brightest here, and that's certainly what Ashley Godwin is. Deputy editor of Russi Journal, flagship periodical of the Royal United Services Institute, and she's a Fulbright scholar with an MA in War Studies from King's College London and degree of modern history from Oxford University. So Peter, why don't you kick us off, and we'll see where you take us.
Well, like you, I was really struck by the notion of the need for a new narrative. You know, and I was thinking, and you mentioned China. China has the peaceful rise, right? If you say, what's China's story, it's the peaceful rise.
And One Belt, One Road now, which is also the new Silk Road, right, which is also a pretty interesting narrative.
So, they've been particularly articulate in that respect. We've had government is the problem, right? That was a narrative for the last 40 years since Ronald Reagan was elected. And that has been a kind of overarching political narrative that has shaped much of U.S. domestic policy. The indispensable nation, another bit of narrative. Powerful idea, now, as we saw this morning, a bit debated. I think I was really struck by Tom Friedman's column on Wednesday, in which he made the argument for the TPP, not so much about trade, but about U.S. leadership. That if having set in motion this initiative globally or in Asia, if it fails because we can't agree domestically, even if all of our partners have now actually played out the game, that it will be another blow to the U.S. as an indispensable nation. It will clearly demonstrate we're quite dispensable, thank you. And so I think it's a very important idea. Interestingly enough, last night, I mentioned we had a CNAS dinner, and somebody asked a very good question at the dinner. It says, what will shape the future agenda that will surprise the next president in this respect? And I gave it some thought, and it seems to me that something which we have only alluded to here, but I think is part of that narrative that we need to be thinking about, and how we think about ourselves in that context. And that was that if you think about that zone from the Afghan-Pakistan border all the way around to Nigeria, it is now coming apart. Virtually every nation in that region is coming apart. The power of central authorities is diminished. It has become a zone of conflict and chaos. And what was isolated conflicts is cascading into a variety, a kind of continuous zone of perpetual conflict. And, you know, it is we uncorked the bottle in some places. We took out Saddam, we took out Gaddafi, and the chaos has now begun to spread. You know, this is the kind of second-order consequence of the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of colonialism, the establishment of the framework of political systems and order in that part of the world, which is now gone, been swept away. And I don't see any way to put it back. I don't, you know, I don't see any institution in the world, any political system, the United Nations, regional entities, or the United States that has the power to actually be able to do anything about that. So I think part of the narrative that we have to think about is how do we actually act in a world where the biggest threats are the kind of bottoms-up chaos that are not driven by ideology, not driven by, in a sense, global aspirations, not driven by something like the Cold War or even the Cool War that David Rothkopf talked about. And I don't know what it can be in that environment. I don't know what role we can play, or anyone can play. I mean, does it just become a zone that we wall off and say, all right, you know, this is the inside that wall, it's chaos, and outside we're just not going to deal with it? Well, we can't. You know, these things metastasize. They become waves of immigrants into Europe. They become disease sources in Ebola. They become sources of potential weapons, like in Iran, and so on. So, you know, we can't escape the consequences, but we need to think about what's the narrative for that next president, because that is the world that they're going to have to deal with, that world of perpetual chaos from Afghanistan to Nigeria.
Peter, well, that's a terrific, Matt, yeah.
I mean, I think we do have a narrative.
Oh, good.
But I think, and the narrative is exceptionalism.
Exceptionalism.
But I think it's a problem both for ourselves and obviously a problem for others. Because if you talk to others, exceptionalism means U.S. expects special privileges.
Everybody has to follow us.
Yes. We expect to put down the rules, but we don't necessarily have to play by them. We expect others to play by them. And what blinds us to it is, obviously, as Americans, we do think our country is exceptional. But it means that we don't really have to really think about it. Our system is going to prevail. Somehow, God is going to deliver it for us. We don't have to work in this. I mean, this is going back to a Puritan idea of the elect, and we are it. So it's all been determined, including the system and everything else. We don't really have to change that much. Others really have to change, get like ourselves. And I think that's a problem. I mean, first, as you're moving to this polycentric world in which we are going to be the minority, and maybe some of our ideas and maybe our values will prevail in some cases, but in other cases, maybe not. And the other thing is that we may have to deal with other countries and civilizations that have very different ideas, and they will have the power actually to make it prevail. I mean, we talk about the internet, and what David Rothkopf didn't talk about is that most of the internet users are not going to be Americans. They're not going to be using English, and they're not necessarily sharing our values.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, and let me come back to that, because I think a lot of the underlying talk here has been how the U.S. is adapting to this world, and whether exceptional or not. But let me go to Ashley. What's your major takeaway? And I must say, when you talk about, this is the reason I like our dynamic stability paper, you talk about what we don't know is going to happen next, your CNAS dinner. And the World Economic Forum annual conference, January of 2014, no one said the words ISIS, Crimea, or Ebola. And next year, that's all anyone was talking about, right? So it's a question of resilience. It's a question of leader. There are different things afoot here. Not trying. You have to be ready for this. What's going to be coming at you. But that's one of my major takeaways here. But Ashley.
Well, actually, I think what Matt was just saying comes back to a really fundamental issue that came up this morning. Actually, a question from the audience from one of the Millennium Leadership Program members, which is the fundamental nature of power versus leadership. And actually, I think that's a real tension with the exceptionalism narrative that you have. Do you want to be a leader of the world, or do you want power? And I think that came up in the debate this morning with Chris Preble saying, actually, the American people, they expect their leaders to lead on their behalf, to do good by them. But that is not the role of a world leader. So I think that is something that really needs exploring. If America is to retain its leadership in a world that is changing really fast, as you say, is involving more and more people of different religions, moralities, worldviews in the conversation by nature of the internet and interconnectivity, actually that's something you really need to consider.
Thank you. Kirk, your major takeaways.
Sure. So my major takeaways are similar to the messages that I've been pounding into Fred and Barry and others at the Atlantic Council for the last 3 years. We have no strategy. We have no narrative around a strategy. We have enormous power and capabilities. And I am optimistic that the Atlantic Council and others, if there is a way of approaching this work, can create a strategy. So that's what I come into this session with. I couldn't be happier with this session. I mean, for a first session, to have the talent on the stage talking about these issues, talking about problems and some solutions, engaging in a dialogue across technology, science, a little bit economics, power, and other things, all the different parts of the world. Over 2 days where, Fred, I think at the end of that, I certainly say, well, I didn't hear anything that would prevent you from creating a strategy. I didn't hear anything that would prevent us over the next 2 years from having a narrative which we can have the staff of the next president understand. Is there a lot of work? Sure, there's a lot of work. But work is good. Is there the talent in this room to create the outputs necessary, the fundamental foundational work to create the narrative? Absolutely. And so I come away with it more optimistic than I walked in, and people who know me know I'm an optimist. So it was more than what I expected. I expected a lot, and it was more than what I expected.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I get the feeling that we're at the creation moment, as we were in 1945. But did people actually know that in 1945? They just went and did it. And then we had 50% of global GDP. Now we have 18% of global GDP. And we have a whole set of other factors that we've talked about the last 2 days. But in some ways, I'm coming away, and I'm going to turn to Matt and Ashley on this, with a feeling that we actually have to set a narrative that goes beyond exceptionalism. That's a basis of the way Americans think about themselves. But the narrative is, what are we going to do? And lacking any other idea right now, mine is sort of, we're going to sustain and redesign the liberal international order so we don't lose it to less benevolent actors and chaos. And I actually think you can put that into a narrative, and you can then be the pivotal power that we were talking about as well yesterday. But let me go to you, Matt, first. Your specialty is strategic foresight. and your work focuses on evaluating the future. You were brilliant in the 2030 report, Global Trends 2030, in doing game changers. And maybe some in the audience have read it. But, you know, if you were doing the 2035 report right now, in other words, the next one for the next president of the United States, how would your game changers, what would be your 3 game changers for the coming decade? What are the great, and game changers is the nice way of saying, we don't know how the hell this factor is going to turn out, but it's going to change everything.
Well, I think the big one, and the one I worry about the most, is conflict. So obviously we've seen, you know, for some time, and even when we were writing the 2030 report, growing conflict in the Middle East. But I think that's taken on a whole new dimension, that you could see this huge Sunni-Shia war break out, and obviously we now have also potential for conflict in Europe, and potential for major state conflict in a way that we didn't have before. So that would be, I mean, I think we're far too complacent because, you know, a lot of us read Steven Pinker and believe that we live in the most peaceful age, and compared to, you know, several millennia ago, we do live in a much more peaceful age, but there is this potential that you could actually go back to major state conflict, both, I think, with Russia, and then there are other states as well. So that's what we really have to worry about, because the one lesson about conflict, and we're learning it now, and I think Peter is alluding to it, is these particularly civil war conflicts go on, we know, for 6 to 9 years. And even when you have ceasefires in there, they're very tenuous. So that is a world, you know, that it's going to be impossible to really manage. And I think the biggest mistake I would ascribe to, or one of the biggest mistakes to this administration, is letting Syria fall apart. Because here you are going to have a safe haven for a lot of things, terrorism being one of those, including humanitarian disaster. So that's number one. The second one, real concern about Europe. You know, economically, but also in a political sense, you're seeing real divisions, north, south, east, west. We don't know what's going to happen in the British election next week. Doesn't mean Britain is on its way out of Europe. You know, these are, you know, we have talked in the Global Trends a lot. We got criticized by the EU Commission for actually posing some of these questions very early on about economic viability and stability with their present model. I mean, that's a big issue for the U.S.
Huge.
And one of our mistakes, I think, has been to, you know, think that we're going to pivot to Asia. I mean, that's where the economic things, that's where everything is happening, forgetting that, you know, Europe also matters very much.
Still the biggest economy, collectively the biggest economy in the world, and our biggest community of common values. Yep.
And the other big game changer, if there are 3, would be the U.S. You know, are we going to get our act together domestically? And there's this huge problem alluded to earlier, that you have a middle class that really feels it's stagnated, really feels it's a loser in globalization. And unless we really tackle that issue, we're not going to get the American public really wanting to play the indispensable nation, even when when America has to play that role. And that's a big problem. And the other thing is, in our systems, I mean, how to institutionalize, it's fine for the NIC, as Peter was saying, to do these every 4 years, but there's no institutional mechanism, really, which makes sure that you have that strategic foresight right at the decision-making table when the big decisions are being made, and people talking about the possible unintended consequences. We needed, you know, that person there when the Iraq invasion decision was made.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you for that sneak preview. I hope we'll get Global Trends 2030 out of the Atlantic Council. Ashley, I want you to share a perspective with the audience from the Millennium Fellows. As you listen to these discussions, do you see that there's a generational divide between how your colleagues are listening to these and absorbing these, and also is your generation ready for all this change? I mean, if you look at what's coming at you, I am just, on the one hand, it's a world of excitement, but it really is going to be a world unlike any that we've ever seen before. And so I'd love to hear your experience of this, how your group was interacting and absorbing all this, but also how you're all looking at the future.
Well, I have to say, from a UK perspective, we do feel that the baby boomer generation has really screwed us over. I don't know if that counts globally, but that's how we feel.
Screwed us over is a technical term.
That is a technical term, yeah. I can't obviously pretend to represent all of the views of the Millennium Fellows here. I am obviously highly privileged to be up here on their behalf. But I think from the discussions we've been having over the last few days, there is a sense that we need greater diversity of voices, and actually that is one thing perhaps that the greater interconnectivity can help us do. I think there's concern about how we capture those and put those into the sort of formal decision-making processes, but I guess that's why we've been convened to sort of work through some of these issues. I also think that we're well placed as a generation to deal with some of the technical issues that are coming our way, because we are the last generation to remember life before the mobile and internet, but we have enough of an understanding of how that is truly integrated into life. Now, I watch a 2-year-old with a tablet, and they're doing things I can't even, how are they doing that? They're so intuitive. So that is still a step beyond us, but I think we have a better understanding than, as you say, the senior policymakers who aren't well versed in science, technology, even the latest social media trends. So I hope we're up to that challenge. Looking around the room, I think we've got a good bunch.
Great, thank you very much for that. Let me go to the audience after one question for Kirk. I mean, you're in the business world, and very often I get the feeling that handling private equity, corporate transactions, does the business world just do strategy better than government? And you heard the criticism that we just need more people, as David Luckhoff said, who can manage. Is it that simple? I mean, what can the business world bring into our discussions here and to make it all work a little bit better?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things which bringing more people into this discussion has to include bringing business leaders into the discussion, whether it's from Silicon Valley or Wall Street or Chicago or Boulder, I don't care. Whether it's the UK or Munich or China, I don't care. But you can learn something from the way they think and the way they take action. They live and die on their actions. They live and die on motivating people in their organizations to do a better job every day. Okay? There's a bottom line. They compete. They love competition. They love chaos. They don't shy away from chaos. They don't shy away from dysfunctional things. They don't shy away from dislocations and risk. They love it. Because they see the opportunity, they see an opportunity to capture that opportunity. Conversely, they can also learn a lot from you on how to think about risk in a bigger and broader way. So, can you learn something? Yeah. Can you bring them in and have them as part of the discussion? Yes. Do they do things better? Yes, but not what you do. What you do, only you can do. Yep. And you have to do it. I think that one of the things which I hope there's a sense coming out of this conference is a deadline, is an urgency, is a reason to really do the foundational work and then have a deliverable. And I know that people hate the word deliverable, but actually have a deliverable and get it done.
Yeah.
Don't just sit there, just get it done. And I think that, they bring that to the table. And I think that's a good thing. And I'd like to see more of that.
Can I add something
yes,
to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that a big thing that business can learn from government, and I share your view, and business is good at getting things done, and a clarity of strategy and purpose and direction, that we do very well. But one of the things that has evolved, I think, very dramatically is the role of stakeholders in business. That, basically, leadership taught about two big groups, customers and shareholders. More and more employees, the communities in which we work, the global environment, geopolitics, all that comes to play in the world of business that is become increasingly profound. And really adept politicians are very adept at managing a great variety of constituencies and stakeholders, and I think that's one of the places where business has something to learn. I work very closely with Governor Brown in California, and I've watched him mature from an immature leader the first time as governor, where he blew his governorship and almost nothing worked, to a really remarkably adept politician with a wife who's sitting in the background doing amazing work that the country doesn't quite appreciate. She's the secret to the success and growth of the governor. But having said that, watching him be much more adept in managing the great variety of stakeholders and turning around the 8th largest economy in the world in a very short amount of time. That's a lesson for business that I think is actually quite profound. And we take, in our company, and I think more and more business leaders take that role of stakeholder relations as a much more profound challenge.
Can I just
yes, please.
to that? So a couple of weeks ago, I was sent on a week-long project management course, which is completely adverse to anything I know. I'm an editor. I work with words, not sort of deliverables and products and all of those things. And listening to the conversation today, it really shocked me. People are talking about fixed strategies, how we need to be more adaptable. Well, and that a strategy by nature in business and presumably in government is adaptable. It has to be. What isn't is the broad strategic vision. And I think where the tension comes, where the difficulty comes for government, is that people confuse a sort of a rigid or a strong, robust strategy with a strong narrative. And if you start to change your strategy, how does that play out against the narrative you've set out? That's very confusing. Government, by nature, has to deal in clear messaging, but actually what goes underneath is much more chaotic and confusing. And I think actually if we need to sort of somehow address that tension.
Thank you very much for that. So let's go to the audience. I've got Harlan, Bob, and please, let's go in this order. Yep, please, go first. And Steve, maybe you'll tell us the business side of this as well. Thank you.
Fred, first, congratulations on a great success. But it seemed to me one thing I would like to have heard more about was historical context. I'll give you 3 quick points. If you go back and read the history of New York City in 1880, the #1 crisis that was going to destroy the city was horse pollution. They didn't know where to put the stuff, they didn't know how to feed them, and this was going to destroy New York City. And go back and take a look. Obviously, that was overtaken by Henry Ford and others. Second, as we debate what's happening with Iran, 1919, the Senate rejected Versailles. And the meddling of the Congress, so forth, is something that has been with us a long time. And third, we talk about innovative thinking in management. In 1961, Bob McNamara, the whiz kid, came in to the Pentagon, put in a system of PPBS that was going to revolutionize everything. It extended the arms race, and it got us into Vietnam. So I would hope in these kinds of thinking about the future and strategy, we aren't so arrogant that we ignore history, because for many of these things, we've been through them before. Yes, the future is going to be different, but history has many lessons that if we fail to heed them, we're going to repeat them, and not necessarily for the better.
I think that's a great idea to have one of the panels with a couple of top historians as it applies to now. Please.
Fred, can I just, Peter said this right from the start, that you talked about how different cultures have a different way of looking at the world and different narrative, which is also, if you're going to do the historical views, you have to have a discussion which is not just a U.S.-centric historical discussion, to pick up on the cultural one as well.
That sounds right. Please, Bob.
Thank you. First of all, terrific conference with some really big and very important ideas. I'd like to follow up on a very significant point that Peter made a few moments ago, and that is about this arc of chaos and instability from AFPAC to Nigeria, which includes much of the Middle East, much of North Africa. I go back to his question, how do you address this? It seems to me you reach back in history to Cardinal Richelieu. He made a very interesting point when Europe was in chaos all around France. He said the country that will do the best and whose ideas will prevail is the country that has the strongest internal cohesion, the strongest society, the strongest economy. He focused on that because he realized it was very difficult to deal with the chaos surrounding France unless France could avoid chaos and divisions internally. And what I think, there are a lot of areas we're not going to be able to do very much with, but the thing that would make it a lot worse is if the areas that we rely on, the strong allies we rely on, and other countries that are now stable also deteriorate. And so my view of what we need to do, if we can't address some of these very chaotic issues that Peter has well described, is to make sure that our fundamental alliances, the countries that have interests that are fundamentally the same as ours, are part of a strong network. If you can build that, if you can emphasize that, if you can be sure that that doesn't deteriorate, for instance, Europe doesn't fall apart, to describe one of the risks that's going on, and we have a good relations with some of the key allies, then at least there are areas of stability that these unstable countries over a period of time can begin to latch onto little by little, as Eastern Europe did when there was a stable Western Europe. The stable Western Europe was sort of a magnet for countries in Eastern Europe just coming off of communism. So it strikes me that the importance of the core, the importance of strengthening the core, is even more important now than ever before. And if we can't deal with the periphery and it's unstable, at least make the core stable and a desirable magnet for other countries if they do, over a period of time, begin to stabilize and want a stronger set of powers to interact with.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, particularly since two of your three game changers had to do with an unstable core.
Yes. If the core is unstable, the rest of the world is going to be even worse.
Any of you want to comment on that? Should I pick up another?
Yeah, I completely agree, Bob. And and like Matt, I'm very worried about Europe.
Yeah.
Again, I'd be interested to hear what Carl Bildt has to say. That you may not want to comment on what I'm about to say, so I'll forgive you if you don't respond. But we have I'm going to say something that is extremely controversial. The EU was created to prevent war, not to assure the shape of sausages and the content of chocolate. It was to keep the French and the Germans from killing the rest of the continent as they had done for the previous 2 centuries. Let's be clear, that's what it was, to bind them together, to bind everybody else together in such a way as to avoid the kind of conflicts that destroyed Europe several times over several centuries. The problem with the euro is it puts Germany in charge. It is the strongest, most financially robust economy in Europe, and the net result of the euro was to essentially put Berlin in charge of the rest of the continent. And unfortunately, that's what World War II was about. They didn't want Berlin running the continent, and now they are. And so finding a way to change the governance structures such that, in fact, you can manage that distribution of power that is necessary rather than the concentration of power that has resulted from the creation of the euro in the hands of a very few people in Berlin, that undermines the legitimacy of the system throughout the rest of Europe, I think is an extremely urgent challenge, and that the Germans need to take up to redistribute the power that they have collected as a result of the euro.
Carl, do you want to rebut? I figured you did.
No, I disagree with that particular point, because I mean, some of us were around before the euro. Germany is strong today. It happens to be the strongest economy. They have been performing rather well. There are 80 million people, so by those things they are bound to be powerful. I would argue they were in economic policy terms far more powerful before the euro, because the D-mark was dominating. And whenever the Bundesbank did something, the slightest move by the Bundesbank in Frankfurt had turmoil in the rest of Europe. So what has been happening with the euro is de facto that the Germans have lost part of their monetary and monetary policy superiority over Europe and agreed to share that with others. They are still powerful within the system, needless to say. But I do remember the time before. It was nightmarish for everyone else because the dependence upon the successful German economy through fluctuating currencies and the interest rates policy of the Bundesbank was horrendous. So I would argue they're less powerful today, but they are the most powerful in Europe.
Let me pass around and pick up some more comments. There we go, please.
Hi. I would like to pose, I guess, an alternative narrative that I've thought about for a long time, but never thought of it before as a narrative. And in posing it, it does sound different from a lot of the ideas that we have heard in this excellent conference. So it's not meant to be a critique of the conference as much as a thought experiment. And this is in line with the last two speakers in design thinking. And the narrative is, and I'm saying this about the US, because that's where I'm from, that this is a world of our making and we have succeeded. And for once, if we kind of said, geez, this is what we wanted, a world of countries that are economically viable, even economically competitive, a world in which 1,000 ideas bloom. If we started to think a little bit more positively, would that give us some interesting ideas about how to think about the future? One of the things that troubles me about the Cold War is we took such a negative view about the role of the US versus the Soviet Union that we spent far too much blood and a lot of treasure on a problem that we might have solved differently had we seen just how far ahead we were. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Steve Nicandros, CEO of Frontier Resources. Let me just say, your narrative picks off of mine, because if it's a world of our making and we have succeeded, now let's prevent it from unraveling is not a bad narrative.
Thanks, Fred. I want to commend everyone. It's really been enjoyable to listen to the last 2 days. My name is Steve Nicandros. I'm chairman of Frontier Resources, a member of the Atlantic Council. And, it struck me, my whole career has been in international business. And Kirk, I really agree with some of your comments. And what I find fascinating is this disjointedness between those that govern and those that run the economic machine of financing those that govern. And there's a gap, and how to solve that gap, I think, is one of the noble objectives of a strategic forum like this and the work here at the Atlantic Council, that I think if we can figure out how to solve that gap and how to close that gap, a lot of things are possible. And I'll give you a case in point. When we travel around the world and invest in emerging markets, which is what we do, I see today a huge race for us to beat the regulators in all these countries. I go into Ukraine, and I'm rushing through the door trying to make investment simultaneously with armies of regulators from the European Union that are bringing thousands of pages of regulation to a nation that is trying to fight a war, is trying to kill corruption, is trying to do all these. And I can name a lot of countries like that. And before you know it, the sunshine of investment is shielded away, and nothing can grow in that environment. Or if it does grow, it grows very slowly. So I would just ask in terms of comments for your comments and all that. And I wonder, as we look to the future, if we don't learn from the past and apply that to the future, I think I'm not as optimistic maybe as some because of the way the governance machines of many governments tend to squash private enterprise.
Matt, do you want to jump in on that?
I mean, I think that's a great idea, and Peter already raised it. I mean, I think, in my talks on global trends, when I would give it to a government audience, particularly Washington, it's very much a pessimistic. I mean, they see change, and business audiences actually look on the chaos in a totally positive way as providing opportunities. And if we can inject some of that more into government, I think then you'll also get a little bit beyond the status quo. I mean, everybody trying to recreate the status quo or the status quo ante. I mean, in government, as I mentioned in the book, I mean, every other day, a policymaker would say, "Oh, I'm so nostalgic for the Cold War," because it was, a simpler world in some ways, in a conceptual way, and you didn't deal with this chaos, and they didn't have to work really to see the opportunities to really recreate a world.
So we have a few minutes. Let's see what questions we have left. We have here. So why don't I take, and Bob. So let me take these last 4 comments, and then we'll wrap up. And there we go.
Thank you. I wanted to raise a question, Jill Shuker. I wanted to raise a question to you, Ashley. Your technical comment about the generation being screwed over in terms of the millennial generation. It seems to me that there's been, at all levels, but in your generation particularly, I've done some teaching at AU, among other places recently, in terms of a very deep loss in faith about institutions. And when I think back as one of the earlier baby boomers, there were certain unifying thematics that seemed to coalesce the generations. What is it that the millennial generation, what is the unifying theme that you have? You mentioned this meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I'm curious about that. I thought at one point it might be the environment in terms of writ large globally, but I haven't gotten that impression, at least from the younger generation that I have been exposed to, specifically, as I said, in terms of teaching or whatever. So what is the unifying theme that you are looking toward, and in what ways, I'm just curious, do you feel that the generations ahead of you have screwed you over?
So actually, hold on to that, because I'm going to pick up the other 3 comments, and you get to speak for your entire generation across the planet. So,
Peter Biar from...
and it will be tweeted.
Peter, I hope you'll speak for the other generation.
I might be the oldest guy in the room. I don't know.
Hold on. Here we go.
Peter Biar from South Sudan, one of the Millennium Fellows. I'm really thankful to be a part of this conference. It's really been fascinating to listen to what is happening. And just to have reflection on the last 2 days, there's a statement that Jamie made yesterday when he was talking about genetics. And he said that science is growing exponentially, thinking is growing linearly, and policy is growing glacially. And I think this sort of summarizes what I have heard for the last few days, because we are pointing out different problems and challenges, but at the end of the day, it seems there is a breakdown in what technologies individuals are able to do, and our own thinking and how we relate to those technologies, and the system that we have set up that governs and make these actually useful in our lives. And it makes me think a little bit about the global governance system that exists and why it has not been evolving, what has been preventing it. And then again, if you think at the next tier of the nation state, and this goes back to the point that you made yesterday, Peter, when you said that the global order is breaking down. And if that global order is breaking down, does even the concept of nation state, is it also breaking down with what we are seeing in the Middle East and in parts of Africa, where you have now 70 years of independence, and governments have yet been able to build legitimate social contract with their populations? And is this order that we set up of boundaries being these things like you cannot touch. It is the way to move in the future. And also to bring in the perspective that the young lady that spoke earlier about the cities, and if you take it a bit to the communities, what is the voice of those cities and communities in these larger things that are happening and affecting them? And then if you break it even more down to individual level, with the connectivity we are talking about, where I can sit in my village in Africa and be tweeting about what is happening in Atlantic Council. But then if you bring in the aspect of technology and the impact it will have in inequality, poverty, and all these sort of things, I begin to wonder, we have not understood, okay, but at the end of the day, are we even putting the resources in the right places? There's a lot of investment in technology, but it seems maybe in the end, where the solution will come from our people, our individuals. And there is enough investment in those individuals. So I just, in the end, maybe to reflect a little bit on these sort of things.
Thank you. And Matt and Peter, why don't you file that for a minute, and then please.
Thank you. Gustav from Sweden, also part of the Millennium Fellows Program. I'm a bit sad over the past days. There's a lot of talk about America losing its narrative or trying, like, not having a narrative. When I think of America, I think of one of the strongest narratives in the world, which is sort of the fundamental idea that everybody have equal access to opportunities. And maybe like one way of thinking of America's narrative is to sort of get back to the reason why people flock to America. And also the reason why American Idol is the world's most popular TV show. And the reason is because that anyone, anywhere can become a star and anyone can make it. And I just want to sort of give that to the people in this room, that like thinking back of that core value and that idea that has empowered America for so long. I think that is a key to also identify America's place in the world over the next couple of years.
Thank you for that comment. Bob, final question? Or comment?
What jumps out at me from this whole thing is the one salient theme is fragmentation at every level I can think of, starting with the diffusion of power in the world to the fragmentation and reemergence of nationalism within Europe and even within nation states. Like, for example, we just had the Scotland vote in the UK. Within the Islamic world, you have this fragmentation. Within our own system, the difference between one of the big differences between 1945 and now is at the time, not only were we the world's biggest economy, we're also the world's largest creditor. Now we're the world's largest military power and the world's largest debtor. And I guess what I have trouble getting my arms around is where does the leverage come to reverse these trends? Because it's not obvious to me.
Thank you, Bob. So this final round, no longer than 2 minutes for each, except for I think if speaking on behalf of the entire future generation, you can have 2.5 minutes. But Kirk, is there something you want to pick up in these final questions?
I'll concede my time to Ashley.
Thanks, Kirk. Peter, Matt, and then Ashley.
Well, and let me apologize. I'm going to have to walk off stage right away because I'm going to do for a speech somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I just want to pick up on your observation. I think for me, the most important anti-poverty tool of the last 20 years was Wikipedia. Wikipedia makes all the knowledge of the world available to any kid on the planet with a connection. And that connectivity is now going to be available to every village in the Sudan, every village in Africa, and it will undermine the power of the central governments. It'll undermine the power of the authoritarian regimes. I had the privilege of asking I had dinner with Mikhail Gorbachev after the Soviet Union fell. And I asked him, so why now? Why did it fall now? And he said it was the internet and the satellite dish. When our people could see the world, we could no longer control them. And they might have had the means to contain the revolution before, and they didn't after that. They didn't have the legitimacy of power that enabled them to survive. And I think when all those kids on the planet have access to all that knowledge and are developing themselves without reference to the needs of the central systems, we're going to see a transformation that is hard to imagine.
Thanks very much. Matt?
Yeah, I guess I'm like Peter. I don't think you should get too pessimistic. I mean, as I said, I do worry a lot on the conflict side, and areas of the world now becoming so conflict-ridden that it's going to be very hard to make the progress. But we've had an enormous amount of progress in the last 2-3 decades, stuff that nobody predicted 30, 40 years ago. And I think, for me, one of the big things is on education. I mean, we are really seeing these rates of enrollment really go up, particularly in the developing world. And we're seeing, for the first time, too, the gender gap close. So access to primary, secondary, even tertiary education for women going up to the point that, the many more female PhDs than male PhDs in Middle East and other places. So I do think that we have the resources there, the human resources, really to solve these issues, and that's what. But it does mean that we need to avoid that conflict, which could really send us backward.
Thank you, Matt. Ashley.
So I have a couple of points. I did. My very technical comment on the UK and the baby boomers was just that. It was a UK perspective. There is widespread thought in the UK amongst my generation in particular that the generation or two above us have had a better life in the sense that they've had NHS, so free healthcare at the point of use, which is looking like it's going to change. They've had a much greater opportunity to own their own property. In major cities like London, we're being priced out in quite a major way, and that affects all sorts of aspects, as we've heard earlier about communities. You're hearing about urbanisation in London, in cities generally, but actually I would hazard a guess that is a reverse trend in London, for example. And also decent pension and old age healthcare, that sort of thing. That's something I think we won't enjoy the benefits of when we are at the age of retirement. Speaking for a generation, I don't really think I can do that, but one common theme that we've heard, and thankfully Peter got to speak before I answered this question, is a loss of voice. And this was something that Alessandra picked up on earlier, that actually I find it quite perverse that we have access to a communication tool like the internet, but actually we feel like we're less engaged. And whether that's because we feel disenfranchised, disaffected, I think that would depend on where you are in the world. But I think that is an issue, and I think Alessandra made the point earlier that an awareness strategy or an awareness campaign is not enough. We need engagement, and that's an important point to my mind. I do have one final point to add on the note of history. I'm a historian by training, and we've heard a lot about how we're at an inflection point here, comparable to 1945 or 1918. I'd actually offer another date from European history, and that's 1856. Why do I say that? Well, at that point, we'd had sort of 40 years prevailing of the concert of Europe. So it was a way of managing instability across Europe, which after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we're coming up to the 200th anniversary of that, so really topical. We had this idea of the 5 great powers in Europe coming together to manage instability. There were civil wars, there were minor conflicts, but they were roughly managed. Whether that achieved a long-lasting positive effect is another question, but they were managed. In 1853, for the first time in those 40 years, you saw major conflict state between Russia and on the other side, the Ottoman Empire, France, and Great Britain. Where was this conflict played out? Crimea. So what I would say is that at that point, I think that's slightly more of a better analogy for us now. We've been at the end of a time where the global system has been working for us, broadly speaking, give or take the role of the Cold War within that. But where do we go next? Unfortunately, that's where my comforting historical analogy comes to an end, because if you look at the following 80 years of European history, you have deep instability caused by changes in nation states, you have colonial competition, and obviously, ultimately, the First World War. Now, I think we have an opportunity to make sure that this doesn't go the same way.
I think you've just gained yourself a writing assignment from the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. I actually think that's a terrific date to have picked out, and also a sobering. dates have picked out. So we're going to close now. This should be an ongoing community and an ongoing process. So all of you in the room, also people who are listening to this online, give us your feedback. Give us your ideas for next year. This isn't just an annual get-together. We're doing strategy all year long in the Scowcroft Center, the Hurry Center, and all 10 programs and centers of the Atlantic Council. So this is an initiative that we started because we thought strategy was lacking, and when strategy is lacking, Syria comes up, Ukraine comes up, and you have no larger picture in which to put it, and you have no strategy on the shelf where you say, well, if that happens in Syria, that's where it fits into our overall thinking. So we actually think this is absolutely crucial for the future of our country and the world. I want to thank Peter Schwartz, who's had to leave us, but he was just terrific over the last 2 days. Kirk Gradkus, thank you so much for your inspiration in New York and all around on this effort. I already thanked earlier Rafiq Bisri, and I want to thank on the staff Rachel Rizzo, the whole Scowcroft team. Dan Chu, thank you so much for leading this initiative. Wonderful job. The Millennium Leaders and Barry Pavel, great leadership of the Scowcroft Center as always. So keep working with us. Let's go into this future and try to make some order out of it. Then we'll see you in all our programming going forward and next year. Thank you.